The wallet was a Bottega Veneta in cognac leather that had been a gift from her board of directors on the occasion of the company's 10th anniversary. And it contained $4,000 in cash, 3 credit cards with limits that exceeded most people's annual salaries, a photograph of her father taken 2 weeks before he died, and the only key to a safety deposit box at First Continental that held documents she had not looked at in 3 years, but could not bring herself to destroy. Sophia Anand knew exactly what was in it, because she had been opening it and closing it for 10 years, with the specific familiarity of someone who has handled the same object long enough that its contents are part of her own inventory. She knew it was gone the moment she stood up from the bench in Meridian Park, where she had been taking a call from her CFO, and walked back toward her car. She retraced the route twice. She asked the man running the coffee cart near the east entrance. She checked with the Parks Department office, which was staffed by a woman who said they received about 3 lost items a week, and a wallet matching that description had not been turned in. Sophia stood on the path in the October afternoon and did the math on what was replaceable and what was not. And the math was not about the $4,000. The wallet arrived at her office building the following morning, not mailed. Carried, a man in a work jacket stood at the reception desk at 7:45 and told the security guard that he had found a wallet in Meridian Park and that the business cards inside indicated this was the right address. The security guard called upstairs. Sophia's assistant called Sophia. Sophia came down herself because some things you handle in person. He was still at the desk when she arrived. He was holding the wallet in both hands, not possessively, carefully, the way you hold something that belongs to someone else and you want to return it in the condition you found it. He was tall, somewhere in his late 30s, with a particular kind of steady that was not performed and not arrived at easily. His work jacket had the name of a roofing company on the chest. His hands were calloused. He had been there long enough that the security guard had offered him a chair, and he had declined. He held out the wallet when he saw her. She took it. "Everything's there," he said. "I didn't open it beyond checking the cards for a name and an address." She looked at the wallet. She opened it. The photograph of her father was exactly where she had left it, face down against the leather, which was how she kept it, so it was not the first thing she saw every time she opened the wallet, but the thing she found when she needed to find it. The cash was there. The key was there. She looked at him. "You came yourself," she said. "It didn't feel like something to put in a mailbox," he said. She reached into the wallet for the cash. He took a small step back. Not away from her, back into the position of someone who is about to leave. "Please," she said. She held out $500. "No," he said. He said it quietly, not as a judgment, as a simple fact about himself. "It's $4,000 in there," she said. "Plus the cards. Plus," she stopped. "Plus things that matter more than those," he said. He looked at the wallet in her hands. "I could tell when I found it." He nodded once. "Have a good day, Miss Anand." He walked to the door. She watched him go. The security guard watched her watch him go. "Name?" she said to the guard. The guard looked at the sign-in sheet. "Thomas Okafor," she said. He signed in with a contractor's badge from Harmon Roofing. His name was Thomas Okafor, and he had been roofing for 9 years, which was not what he had planned, and which had turned out to be one of the better unplanned things in his life. He had a particular aptitude for reading a roof the way other people read a room. Standing in a driveway and looking at the pitch and the flashing and the granule loss on the shingles from 30 feet. And knowing before he climbed what he was going to find when he got there. And knowing whether what he found was a repair or a replacement. And knowing the difference mattered because replacing something that could be repaired cost people money they did not have, and repairing something that needed replacing cost them their ceiling in February. He was known for not doing either. His clients were mostly in neighborhoods where the roofing budget was not flexible, and the consequences of a wrong call were immediate. And he had built his reputation across 9 years on the basis of calling it correctly and charging for the work he did rather than the work that would have been more profitable. He had a daughter named Yemi, who was 6, and who had recently decided that she wanted to understand how everything worked, which meant that Thomas's evenings had acquired a new structure that involved explaining, in terms accessible to a 6-year-old, the mechanisms behind rain gutters and bread rising, and why the moon looked bigger on the horizon than overhead, and why some roofs were steep and some were flat, and which was better. He had told her flat roofs were better in dry climates, and steep roofs were better in wet ones, and she had considered this for a moment and said that the roof was making a decision based on where it lived. And he had said yes, that was exactly right. And she had looked very satisfied and moved on to why bread rose. Yemi's mother had been gone for 2 years, not through death but through a departure that had been preceded by 3 years of a marriage that had been honest about its difficulties and eventually honest about its limits. Thomas had not contested the departure, because the honesty had made it clear that contesting it would not fix the thing the honesty had named. He had Yemi on weekdays and every other weekend, and he had built the weeks around her in the specific way of someone who has decided that the structure of his days is something he builds on purpose, not something that happens to him. She kept a jar on the kitchen windowsill that she called the question jar, which contained folded pieces of paper with questions she was saving for later because she had too many questions for one day and some of them could wait. The jar currently held 11 questions. He read one each morning while he made her lunch. Yesterday's had been, if the roof decides based on where it lives, does where I live decide things about me? He had thought about this on the drive to the park job and on the drive back, and he had not arrived at a complete answer, but he had the shape of one. He had found the wallet under the bench where she had been sitting, tucked against the leg in a way that suggested it had slid from a bag rather than been dropped, and he had looked at it for a moment and then picked it up and opened it to find the owner and seen the photograph before he saw anything else. A man, older, with a specific quality in his face of someone laughing at something that genuinely surprised him, and behind him what looked like a hospital corridor, which was an odd place for that kind of laugh. He had looked at the photograph for a moment, and then found the business cards, and closed the wallet, and carried it home and put it on the kitchen counter, and looked at it that evening, and thought about the person who had found it missing. He had not thought about the $4,000. He was aware this said something about him, but he did not think about that either. He had taken Yemi to school the next morning and gone to the building on the business card before his first job. Sophia followed him on the 3rd day, not because she suspected him of anything, because she had spent 2 days thinking about a man who had returned a wallet containing $4,000 and a photograph that no amount of money replaced, and had declined $500 with the specific quietness of someone for whom the declination was not a performance of virtue, but a statement of terms. She had looked up Harmon Roofing. She had found the company's website, which was minimal and direct, and a contractor review site on which Thomas Okafor had 41 reviews, all of which said some version of the same thing in different words. He told me the truth about what was needed, and did exactly that, and charged me fairly, and did not suggest anything extra. 41 versions of the same sentence, which was the kind of consistency that was either manufactured or genuine, and something in the wallet's return had given her an instrument for telling the difference. She went to the address of the job he had listed on the sign-in sheet, which the security guard had given her because Sophia had a way of asking for things that made people want to help her. It was a row house on Clement Street, with a roof that had been losing its battle with the weather for longer than was ideal. She parked across the street. She watched. Thomas was on the roof. She could see him moving across the pitch with the specific economy of someone who was completely comfortable at that elevation, which was itself a kind of competence that was invisible until you watched someone who had it and understood that most people did not. He was working with another man, younger, and she watched Thomas stop and look at something and then show the younger man what he was looking at, and wait while the younger man looked, and then nod when the younger man found it. He did not do the thing for the younger man. He showed the younger man how to find it himself. She stayed for 40 minutes. She did not identify herself. She drove back to her office and sat at her desk and thought. She sent him a job, not through his company directly, through her building manager, who needed a roof assessment on a commercial property Anand Capital had acquired in the fall, and whose previous roofing contractor had provided an estimate so far outside the range of what Sophia's property manager considered reasonable that she had flagged it for a second opinion. Sophia told her property manager to call Harmon Roofing. Thomas arrived at the commercial property 3 days later and walked the roof for 40 minutes and came back downstairs with a written assessment that her property manager photographed and sent to Sophia. The assessment was 11 pages. It listed every problem in order of urgency, with a photograph for each and a repair cost beside each item, and at the bottom a total that was 60% below the previous estimate. The bottom of the last page had a single paragraph that said, "The remaining 40% of the previous estimate represents work that this roof does not currently need, and will not need for at least 8 years. If the items above are addressed correctly." Sophia read the assessment twice. She called her property manager. She said, "Hire him." Her property manager said he had already left, but he'd signed the estimate copy before going. She looked at the signature. She looked at the 11 pages. She looked at the paragraph at the bottom that described work the roof did not need. She called Harmon Roofing. Thomas answered because it was his company, just him and 2 others, and he answered his own phone. She said she wanted to have a conversation about the assessment. He said he could come to the office. She said she would come to him. She went to the Clement Street job the following afternoon, because the row house was where he was, and she had already established that she preferred to meet things in the place they actually existed, rather than the place that was convenient. He was on the ground when she arrived, loading equipment, and he looked at her car and then at her, and his face moved through a brief recalibration before returning to its usual register. "Miss Anand," he said. "The paragraph at the bottom," she said, "about the work the roof doesn't need." "Yes," he said. "You understand that you could have done that work," she said, "and billed for it, and I would have paid for it without knowing." "Yes," he said. "Why didn't you?" He looked at the roof. "Because it didn't need doing," he said, "and I'd know." She looked at him. He looked at the equipment he was loading. Not evasively, he was loading equipment and having a conversation simultaneously because that was what was in front of him. "The wallet," she said. He looked at her. "The photograph," she said. "You saw it." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Then you know who he was." "I know he was someone who made you laugh the way that photograph shows," he said, "in a hospital hallway. Which means the laugh was something you found there, which is the harder kind to find." She looked at the row house roof. She looked at her hands. She had not talked about the photograph with anyone, which was a choice she had made 3 years ago when she put it face down in the wallet, and had maintained without examining whether it was still the right choice. "He died in that hospital," she said. "The week after that photograph." Thomas set down what he was holding. He did not do anything else. "He was the one who built the company," she said, "the original version. I built the current version. But the reason I built it was him. She paused. And the reason I couldn't look at the photograph was that I wasn't sure, for a long time, whether what I'd built was actually what he'd have wanted, or just what I decided he'd have wanted. Thomas was quiet for a long time. The street was quiet the way streets are quiet in October afternoon, school run hours. The particular pause before the neighborhood reconvenes. "What's the company do?" he said. "Infrastructure investment," she said. "We fund projects in underserved municipalities. Roads, water systems, broadband." She paused. He was a civil engineer. He spent 30 years building things in places that couldn't get anyone else to build them. Thomas looked at the row house. He looked at the block. He looked at the street with the lifted sidewalk and the patched asphalt and the gutters that were managing. "He'd have wanted it," he said. She looked at him. "A man who spent 30 years building in places nobody else would build," he said. "His daughter spending 30 years funding the same work." He picked up what he'd set down. "That's not a question." He looked at her once. "That's just what it is." She went home that evening and took the photograph out of the wallet and put it on her desk. Face up. She called Thomas the following week about a second property. And then a third. By the fourth call, they both understood that the properties were real, and the calls were also something else, which neither of them named, because naming things prematurely was how you made them smaller than they were. Yemi met her in January at the office because Thomas had a meeting with Sophia's property manager, and the school had a half day, and the alternatives were Miss Patience next door, who Yemi liked fine but who did not. Yemi had observed, asked very interesting questions. She sat in the chair across from Sophia's desk and looked at the photograph and then at Sophia. "Is that your dad?" she said. "Yes," Sophia said. "He looks like he's laughing at something good," Yemi said. "He is," Sophia said. Yemi looked at the photograph for another moment. "My dad laughs like that when I get something right that I've been trying to get right," she said. "It's a specific laugh, different from regular laughing." "Yes," Sophia said. "That's exactly what it is." Yemi looked at her with the frank assessment of a 6-year-old who has collected 11 questions in a jar and is deciding whether to spend one. She decided to spend one. "Do you have a question jar?" she said. Sophia looked at her. "I don't," she said. "But I think I should." Yemi nodded. This was the correct answer. She went back to the book she had brought, which was about weather systems, and read it with the focused pleasure of someone spending an afternoon exactly as she would choose to spend it. 1 year later. The question jar on Sophia's desk held 7 questions, 4 of which were hers and 3 of which were Yemi's, contributed at Yemi's discretion during visits that had become a structure in the week, rather than an occasion in it. The photograph of her father was on the desk, face up, beside a framed photograph of a water treatment facility in a municipality in the southwest that Anand Capital had funded 2 years ago, and which had been completed in November, and which her father had, she had learned from the project files, surveyed in 1987 and written a report about that said it needed exactly what it now had. Thomas's 4th commercial property assessment was on her desk also, 11 pages, the same format as the first one, the same paragraph at the bottom about work that was not needed. She had stopped being surprised by the paragraph. She had started thinking of it as the signature, the way you learn to recognize the quality of a person's work by the specific way they are honest about its limits. He was in the building. He came to her office at the end of the day and knocked on the open door, and she looked up. And they were both quiet for a moment, with the question jar between them on the desk and the photograph behind it. And the city in the window going amber in the winter afternoon. His hand rested on the doorframe, and she looked at it and looked at him, and neither of them moved for a moment in the specific way of people who are standing at the edge of something they have been approaching for a year and have finally arrived at. She picked up one of Yemi's questions from the jar and read it. She held it up so he could see it from the doorway. He read it. He looked at her. He came in. Some things that are returned to you are not the things you thought you lost. And some people who find what you've dropped carry it to you, not because they want anything from you, but because they have already decided, in some prior and fundamental moment, who they are. Share this with someone who has had something returned to them that they didn't know they needed back. Subscribe for more stories like this every week. And tell us, if someone returned something to you that contained the thing you'd been afraid to look at, and then said exactly the right thing about it without being asked, would you have followed them, or would you have sent the $500 and called it done? We read every one.